Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I've lived on this land for over 20 years. 100 acres of rolling fields, a sturdy farmhouse, and a barn that's seen more storms than I can count. It's not much, but it's home. Out here, you learn to be self-reliant. The closest town is a good 30-minute drive, and the nearest neighbor is even farther. That morning started like any other. I woke up before the sun, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stepped onto the porch to watch the sky shift from black to deep orange. There was a stillness in the air, a strange kind, the kind that makes your skin prickle for no reason. The animals were quieter than usual, too. No early morning crow from the rooster, no restless shuffling from the cows in the field. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Something felt off. I grabbed my rifle, an old habit whenever things didn't seem right, and set off to check the perimeter. My first stop was the chicken coop. I expected to see them flapping around, eager for feed, but the door was wide open. Feathers littered the ground. The birds were gone. I muttered a curse under my breath. Maybe a coyote got in. Wouldn't be the first time. But as I knelt to inspect the dirt, my stomach tightened. The tracks were strange. Too big for a coyote. Too erratic for anything I'd seen before. That's when I heard it. A low groan, raspy and unnatural, carried on the wind from the direction of the barn. I stood, tightening my grip on the rifle. The sound wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. I should have turned back right then, should have locked the doors, grabbed my supplies, and left. But I didn't. I took a step toward the barn. And that was my first mistake. I moved slowly, rifle raised, my boots crunching softly against the dirt as I approached the barn. The groan came again, longer this time, like something struggling to breathe. I hesitated at the barn doors. They were slightly ajar, enough for a sliver of morning light to cut through the darkness inside. My gut screamed at me to turn back, but my hands moved on their own. I pushed the doors open. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The old tractor sat in the corner where it always did. Hay bales were stacked neatly against the far wall. But then my eyes landed on the stalls, specifically the one I kept for an old mare named Daisy. She was on the ground. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the man crouched beside her. At least, I thought he was a man. His back was to me, hunched over Daisy's side, his arms moving in a jerky, unnatural way. His clothes were torn, stained with something dark. His skin was pale, too pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. And then I saw his hands. They weren't hands anymore. They were claws. Fingernails cracked and elongated, curling into sharp points. A sickening wet sound filled the air as he tore into Daisy's hide. I finally found my voice. "Hey!" The figure froze. For a moment, the barn was deathly silent. Then, in one shuddering movement, the man turned his head toward me. His eyes were wrong, completely white like milky glass. His mouth hung open, smeared with something I didn't want to think about. His lips curled back, and he let out a sound that sent ice through my veins, half a gurgle, half a growl. I raised my rifle. "Back off." He didn't. He lunged. I barely had time to react. My fingers squeezed the trigger and the shot echoed through the barn. The man staggered, a red stain blooming on his chest, but he didn't fall. He just kept coming. I've shot a lot of things in my life, Coyotes, wild boars, even the occasional rattlesnake that got too close to the house. Every single one of them went down when a bullet hit the right spot. But this thing, it barely flinched. I pumped another round into the chamber and fired again, this time aiming higher. The shot slammed into its shoulder, jerking it to the side, but it still didn't stop. If anything, it moved faster. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a rusted bucket. The thing lunged, fingers curled like claws. Its milky eyes locked onto me. I had one shot left before I'd have to reload. So I took it, right between the eyes. This time, the thing jerked mid-step, its head snapping back. It swayed for a moment, then crumpled to the dirt floor like a puppet with its strings cut. I didn't breathe, didn't move, just stood there, rifle still raised, waiting for it to twitch. It didn't. Slowly, I exhaled. My hands were shaking. What the hell had I just seen? I turned my attention to Daisy. The poor mare let out a weak, pitiful sound. The wounds on her side were deep, torn open in jagged strips. I knew, painfully, that there was nothing I could do for her. I clenched my jaw and did what needed to be done. The shot was quick. The silence afterward felt heavy, like the whole world had stopped to hold its breath. Then, off in the distance, I heard something. A sound carried on the wind, low and droning, rising and falling like a tide. It was coming from the direction of the road. I hurried out of the barn, stepping into the morning light. My heart hammered as I scanned the fields beyond my property. And that's when I saw them. Silhouettes, moving toward my farm. Dozens of them. Maybe more. All staggering, all slow, all with the same unnatural, jerking motions as the thing in my barn. And they were coming straight for me. My breath caught in my throat. There were too many. More than I could count. Moving in uneven, lurching strides, their bodies swaying like they barely knew how to walk. And they were all headed straight for my farm. I gripped my rifle tighter, mind racing. I didn't know what these things were, but I knew one thing for sure. If they reached my house, I wouldn't last long. I ran. Boots pounding against the dirt, I sprinted toward the farmhouse. My truck was parked out front, but I didn't have time to chance it. The keys were inside, and if one of those things got too close while I was fumbling with the ignition, I'd be done for. No, the house was my best bet. I had supplies. A few hunting rifles. Ammunition. Enough to hold out, at least for a little while. I reached the porch and threw the door open, slamming it shut behind me. My hands worked fast, locking every latch, sliding the heavy deadbolt into place. Then I ran for the windows. They were getting closer. I could see them more clearly now. Their skin was gray and blotchy, covered in deep gashes and bruises. Some wore torn clothing. Others barely had anything left on them but scraps. Their faces were all wrong. Vacant eyes, slack mouths, some of them twitching like they weren't fully in control of their own bodies. And the smell. Even through the glass, it hit me. A thick, rancid stench that made my stomach churn. I pulled the curtain shut. Think. I had to think. I rushed to the closet, yanked it open, and grabbed my shotgun. It was an old pump action, reliable as ever. I loaded it fast, hands steady despite the way my pulse pounded in my ears. Then I grabbed more shells, a hunting knife, anything I thought might help. A deep, guttural moan sounded just outside the house. I turned, heart slamming against my ribs. They were here. A shadow passed by the window, slow and heavy, then another. Fingernails scraped against the wood siding. Then thud. Something hit the front door. Hard. Then it hit again. And again. The walls seemed to shake with every impact. I backed away, gripping the shotgun tight. This house had stood through storms, blizzards, and even a tornado once. But I wasn't sure it would stand through this. The pounding on the door didn't stop. It only got worse. More fists joined in, slamming against the wood in a slow, relentless rhythm. The sound crawled under my skin, making my breath come fast and shallow. Think, damn it, think. The house was sturdy, but it wasn't a fortress. If those things kept pushing, they'd get in. I needed a plan now. I ran to the back door and checked the lock. Still secure. Then I grabbed a heavy oak chair from the kitchen and jammed it under the doorknob for extra reinforcement. The windows were next. Most of them had old wooden shutters. I slammed them shut, locking each one as fast as I could. The glass wouldn't hold if those things really wanted in, but it might slow them down. Thud. I jumped. That one was louder, closer. I moved to the front window, shotgun gripped tight, and risked a quick glance outside. They were everywhere. A mass of pale, shifting bodies crowded my porch. More were stumbling in from the fields, drawn by the noise. Their hands scraped at the walls, their faces pressed against the windows, their empty eyes rolling in their sockets. The crack! The front door splintered. I backed up fast. My brain screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door shook again. A long, gurgling moan drifted through the crack in the wood. Fingers pushed through, twisting, clawing at the air. I raised my shotgun, aimed. The next hit tore the door wide open. And they poured in. The first one barely looked human anymore. Its skin was peeling, patches of it hanging loose from its arms and face. Its jaw unhinged as it lunged at me, letting out a hungry, rasping groan. I pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared. The thing's head snapped back and it collapsed to the floor. But more followed. I fired again. Another one dropped. But there were too many. They kept coming, their bodies tripping over each other, some crawling when their legs gave out. I turned and ran. The hallway, the stairs, the attic, yes, the attic. I bolted up the steps, boots hammering against the wood. Behind me, the moans grew louder. Closer. I reached the attic door, yanked it open and scrambled inside. Then I slammed it shut and locked it. Darkness swallowed me. All I could hear was my own breath, ragged and sharp. And below me, the sound of my house being overrun. The attic was pitch black. Dust hung thick in the air, stirred up by my ragged breaths. I pressed my back against the door, shotgun still clutched tight. Below me, the house groaned under the weight of them. I could hear the floorboards creak, furniture being knocked over, the wet shuffling of feet as they moved through my home. And the moans. Low, droning, relentless. I forced myself to breathe slower. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to think. The attic was small, mostly used for storage. A few old trunks, stacks of newspapers, some broken furniture. No way out except for a tiny window near the roof, barely big enough to squeeze through. I needed an escape plan. Slowly, I moved toward the window, keeping my footsteps light. I reached it and wiped away a thick layer of dust with my sleeve. Outside, the farm was barely visible in the dim morning light. The fields stretched out endlessly, my truck still parked in the driveway, and the dead, more of them than before, were staggering through my property, drawn by the noise. I clenched my jaw. If I could make it to the truck, I had a chance. My keys were still inside the house, but I kept a spare in the tool shed out back. If I could get there, I could be gone in minutes. But first, I had to get out of this attic. I turned back toward the door. The moans were still rising from below, but something else caught my ear. Something worse. A new sound. The stairs. They were coming up the stairs. I tensed, gripping the shotgun tighter. The attic door was thin, too thin. If they started pounding on it, it wouldn't hold for long. Then a soft creak, right outside the door. I swallowed hard. I could feel them on the other side, their bodies pressing against the wood, their fingers twitching, reaching. Then bang! The doorframe splintered. I staggered back as the top panel of the door cracked inward. Fingers, gray and gnarled, pushed through the gap, clawing at the air. I didn't have time to hesitate. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast tore through the wood, and for a moment the moans stopped. The hands twitched, then went limp. But it wouldn't last. I had to move. I turned, grabbed the closest thing I could find, a rusted old crowbar, and smashed it against the attic window. Glass shattered, sending shards raining down onto the roof outside. No time to think. I slung the shotgun over my shoulder, gritted my teeth, and hauled myself through the window. The roof was slick with morning dew, and for a terrifying second I almost lost my footing. But I steadied myself and started moving, crawling toward the edge. Below me, the dead still swarmed the yard. And now, they were looking up. Balancing on that slanted rooftop, I felt more exposed than ever. Below, the dead gathered like vultures, their pale faces turned upward, mouths hanging open in eerie silence. Then, almost in unison, they started moving. Some stumbled toward the base of the house, clawing at the walls. Others reached for the porch, their filthy hands grasping at nothing. A few tried climbing, but their stiff limbs weren't made for it. That gave me a sliver of hope. But I still wasn't safe. I edged my way across the roof, keeping low, my boots sliding slightly on the damp shingles. The tool shed was my goal, just beyond the backyard, past the barn. If I could get to it, I could grab the spare truck key and make a run for the driver's seat. The problem? There was a whole sea of those things between me and freedom. I reached the edge of the roof and looked down. The drop wasn't far, maybe 10 feet to the awning below, then another short jump to the ground. Doable. I slung the shotgun across my back, gripped the rusted gutter, and lowered myself carefully. My boots barely touched the awning before crack. The wood snapped. I dropped like a stone, hitting the ground hard. The impact jolted through my legs, but I bit back a curse and rolled to my feet. Then I heard it, that horrible, gut-wrenching moan, so close I could feel it. I spun around. One of them had been lurking just around the corner of the house. A woman. At least, she had been once. Half of her face was missing, her jaw hanging loose like it was barely attached. She lunged. I yanked my knife from my belt and drove it straight into her forehead. The moan cut off instantly. She crumpled at my feet. But that one sound, the shuffle, the attack, the impact, was all it took. More were turning toward me. The closest ones broke into an awkward jerking sprint. I bolted. The barn loomed ahead. The tool shed was just beyond it, so damn close. My lungs burned, my legs screamed. I wasn't fast enough. One of them reached for me, fingers scraped against my sleeve. I swung the shotgun like a club, bashing it across the thing's head. It staggered back, giving me just enough time to close the distance. The tool shed was right there. I reached the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside. Slam! I turned the lock. For a second, I just stood there, gasping for air, my back pressed against the wooden wall. Then I realized I wasn't alone. Something was breathing in the dark. The air inside the tool shed was thick with the scent of rust, oil, and something else. Something foul. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but I could hear it. Shallow, raspy breaths coming from somewhere in the back of the shed. Slowly, I unslung my shotgun, keeping it raised as I reached for the pull string hanging from the ceiling. My fingers found it, and with a sharp yank click, the single hanging bulb flickered to life, casting weak yellow light over the cramped space. And there it was, hunched in the corner, wedged between the shelves and an old workbench. A man, or at least what was left of one. His overalls were torn, stained with something dark. His face, what little of it remained, was barely recognizable. His bottom jaw hung open at an unnatural angle, broken clean through. His lips trembled as if trying to form words, but only a thick, gurgling sound came out. His eyes snapped to mine. He moved. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the trigger. The shot roared through the small space, deafening in the confined walls. The thing's head snapped back, and it collapsed against the workbench. I stood there for a second, chest heaving. Then I moved. I scrambled to the metal shelf near the back wall, fingers shaking as I pushed aside toolboxes and cans of motor oil. Come on, come on. Then my hand closed around it. The spare truck key. Relief flooded through me, but I wasn't safe yet. Outside, the moans were growing louder. They'd heard the gunshot. They were coming. I gritted my teeth, gripping the key so tight it dug into my palm. I had seconds, maybe, before that shed door got ripped open. I turned, scanning the walls for anything else useful. My eyes landed on an old hatchet hanging from a hook. I grabbed it, stuffing it into my belt before shoving the shotgun over my shoulder. Then I braced myself. I took a breath, and I threw open the door. The dead were right there. A dozen of them, maybe more. Their sunken eyes locked onto me in an instant. No time to think. I sprinted. I tore across the yard, boots kicking up dust. The truck was close, 20 yards, 10, then my stomach lurched. One of them was already there. A massive man, dressed in what used to be a sheriff's uniform, his gut torn open, dried blood soaking his belt. He was leaning against the truck door, fingers twitching as he turned toward me. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The dead behind me were closing in. I gritted my teeth and charged. The last thing I saw before swinging the hatchet was his mouth opening wide. I swung the hatchet with everything I had. The blade buried itself deep into the sheriff's skull with a sickening crack. His head snapped back, his body going stiff. Then he collapsed against the truck, sliding down in a heap. But there was no time to breathe. The moans behind me were closing in, a tidal wave of death rolling across my farm. I ripped the hatchet free and lunged for the truck door. My fingers fumbled with the handle, yanked it open, then something grabbed my shoulder. Cold, bony fingers dug into my flesh. I spun, swinging the hatchet blindly. The blade hacked into a withered arm, sending the thing staggering back. Another was already lunging, its rotting mouth snapping inches from my face. I threw myself into the truck, slammed the door, locked it. The dead swarmed. They slammed against the windows, their hands streaking grime across the glass, their faces pressed in, empty eyes rolling, mouths working hungrily. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I threw it into reverse, slamming my foot on the gas. The truck lurched backward, plowing through the crowd. Bodies crumpled under the tires, bones snapping like dry branches. Then I twisted the wheel, shifting into drive. I hit the gas hard. The truck surged forward, mowing down anything in its path. I didn't look back. I tore down the dirt road, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The farmhouse, the barn, the fields, they blurred past me, fading into the distance. My farm, my home, gone. I swallowed the lump in my throat and focused on the road. But the nightmare wasn't over. Not even close. Because as I sped toward town, I saw the smoke. Thick black plumes rising against the pale morning sky. The closer I got, the worse it looked. Cars abandoned on the road, storefronts with shattered windows, bodies, some still, some moving, and beyond it all, the sound that made my blood run cold. Sirens, gunshots, screams. The world wasn't just ending on my farm. It was ending everywhere. I kept driving. The road into town was littered with wreckage, abandoned cars, overturned tractors, even a school bus sitting sideways across both lanes. Smoke curled from buildings in the distance, and the closer I got, the worse the air smelled. Burnt rubber, blood, rot. I gritted my teeth and pressed the gas. But then movement. Up ahead, near the gas station. Not the slow, dragging shuffle of those things. Someone was running. I slammed the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop as a figure sprinted toward me, waving their arms. A woman. She looked rough. Dirt smeared across her face, her clothes torn, but she was alive. I threw the truck into park and grabbed my shotgun, cracking the door open just enough to shout, "You bit?" She shook her head furiously. "No, please, let me in." Behind her, the dead spilled out from between the gas pumps. At least a dozen, maybe more, their hollow eyes locked onto her like starving animals. I made my decision in a heartbeat. "Get in." She yanked the door open and scrambled inside. I barely had time to hit the gas before they reached us, their hands slamming against the truck. The tires screeched as we tore out of the parking lot, bodies bouncing off the sides. She was gasping for breath, clutching a hunting knife in her lap. "Thank you," she managed between deep, shuddering inhales. I just nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. "What's your name?" "Claire." "Where were you headed?" She let out a hollow laugh. "Anywhere but here." I glanced at her. "Town's gone, ain't it?" Her expression darkened. She nodded. "Went bad fast. First the hospital, then the police station. No one could stop it." She swallowed hard. "I saw a guy in uniform say they were setting up an evacuation center a few miles west past the old highway." I clenched my jaw. An evacuation center. Maybe it was real, maybe it was already overrun. But it was something. "Then that's where we're going," I said. Claire sat back, her grip tightening on the knife. Neither of us spoke after that. The road stretched on, empty and uncertain. I didn't know what we'd find out there. Didn't know if we'd make it. But I was still alive. For now, that was enough. For now, I just kept driving. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.